After a terrorist attack, it's always a good idea to try to understand the terrorist's motives. And the main concern when examining his motives is whether those motives are shared by others. If they are, then even after police have apprehended or killed the terrorist, there may be future attacks by like-minded individuals. Islamic terrorist attacks are pretty easy to examine because the terrorists regularly shout their primary motive during the attacks, Allahu Akbar. They sometimes leave notes or videos going into more detail, and we have their playbooks, the Quran and the Hadith, which provide the ideological framework for the attacks. Islamic terrorist attacks have become so common that non-Islamic attacks now stand out simply for being non-Islamic. For instance, sandwiched between an Islamic terrorist attack yesterday in Mali and another Islamic terrorist attack today in France was an anti-Muslim terrorist attack in London. A 47-year-old man named Darren Osborne plowed a rental van into Muslims who were leaving a mosque after their evening Ramadan prayers. Some people were surprised that there was an attack on Muslims, but I wasn't. Why wasn't I surprised? Because I've been calling it for years. For years, I've been warning that as jihadis slaughter unbelievers in the name of Allah, people's concerns about the jihadi threat are going to grow. And if politicians and the media continue to silence these people, forcing them to bottle up their frustrations, some of them are eventually going to give up on confronting Islam peacefully. All the way back in 2010, I posted a response to the mayor of Dearborn, whose officers had arrested us and thrown us in jail for having a peaceful discussion with Muslims on a public street. I pointed out that when the government becomes an obstacle to open, honest discussion, this doesn't help any of the parties involved. Instead, it keeps people from learning to discuss sensitive topics peacefully, which only leads to more hostility. When it comes to the conflict between Islamic values and Western values, there are three basic approaches we can take. Run us through them, David Wood from 2010. First, you can ignore the fact that there are differences between Islamic law and Western values. Just pretend the differences don't exist and maybe they'll go away. Or at the very least, you can pass the problem on to the next generation, let them deal with it. This seems to be the mayor's approach and the overall approach of Western leaders. Here we are 7 years later, and that's still the approach taken by politicians, the media, Hollywood, and the entire Western education system. Second, you can draw attention to differences between Islamic law and Western values. Point them out, bring them to the surface, discuss the differences, debate them in public. Then people learn what the facts are on both sides of the issue, and everyone realizes that we can discuss sensitive topics without wanting to kill each other. This is the position of Act 17. 7 years later, that's still the approach of Act 17. Third, you can get angry at Muslims and burn Qurans and say that we should nuke Mecca and call Muslims names like raghead and camel jockey. That's the position the mayor apparently attributes to us, but that's the position we're trying to keep people away from. You see, the mayor's position, let's call it the ostrich approach, will not end well. You can't ignore the conflicts between Islamic law and Western values forever. And if you continue to ignore them, the tension is going to build, and we're seeing this all around the world, until people finally can't take it anymore and people on both sides react in a really bad way because they haven't learned to discuss difficult issues like adults. What did I say would happen if we couldn't come together to have open, honest discussions about the conflicts between Islam and Western values? I said that there would be people on both sides who would take a more hostile approach. And we didn't have to wait until 2017 to see this happen. I posted that video in 2010. A year later, in 2011, we had the Anders Breivik attacks in Norway. Breivik killed 77 people and injured more than 300, and he posted his manifesto online just before the attacks. In his manifesto, Breivik explained in detail why he decided to become a terrorist. He said that growing up in Norway, he kept witnessing Muslim immigrants assaulting Norwegians. He said that he personally witnessed around 50 of these attacks. So he came to view Muslim immigration as a problem. In the 1990s, he studied the Quran and the Hadith and concluded that Islam was actually the problem. He decided to go into politics to share his concerns, but then he changed his mind and began planning a terrorist attack. Why did he change his mind? Since David Wood from 2011 went through the entire 1,500-page manifesto, we'll let 2011 David Wood explain Breivik's reasoning by quoting Breivik. In the 1990s, when Breivik became convinced that Islam is a threat to European civilization, he decided to go into politics. But he soon realized that anyone who questions Islam is labeled a racist and marginalized. Since Islam was beyond criticism, Breivik came to regard political participation as utterly pointless. It is meaningless to participate in the democratic process when you are not allowed to raise important issues without being subjected to political and social persecution through stigmatization and ridicule. It is time to acknowledge that we, the cultural conservatives of Western Europe, are deceiving ourselves to believe that it is remotely possible to change the system democratically. Breivik realized this in the year 2000. Around the same time, he also concluded that the media has such a stranglehold on public perception, speaking out against Islam is futile. There is no freedom of speech in Europe. If you don't cheer and embrace your own annihilation, you are a racist bigot, an enemy of the establishment, and must be suppressed, ridiculed, undermined, and persecuted. Well now, you're a young Norwegian who sees immigration and Islam as the chief threats to Western society, but all peaceful avenues of addressing these threats have been blocked by politicians and the media. What do? In order to successfully penetrate the cultural, Marxist, multiculturalist media censorship, we are forced to employ significantly more brutal and breathtaking operations which will result in casualties. In order for the attack to gain an influential effect, assassinations and the use of weapons of mass destruction must be embraced. The primary goal of the shock attacks is not the immediate physical manifestation of the attack, destroying a few buildings, killing a few hundred traitors, but rather the indirect effects. Shock attacks will have the potency to penetrate the strict censorship regime of the cultural Marxists, multiculturalists. The purpose of the violence is to break through the protective wall the media has constructed around the topic of Islam. Breivik wanted to do something so heinous that even the combined forces of the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, ABC News, and the New York Times could not silence his message. He justifies the move from no peaceful means available to violence is necessary by quoting Robert Spencer. Oh, did I say Robert Spencer? I meant John F. Kennedy, who famously declared, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Interestingly, Breivik claims that Muslim terrorists are the ones who showed us how to break through the media's stronghold. Unfortunately, spectacular operations like these are the only way to be heard. Everything else we have tried has failed and yielded nothing. The Muslims showed us that deadly shock attacks are the only tool we have at the moment which will guarantee that our voice is heard. Breivik explained exactly why he chose the path of violence. He chose the path of violence because he concluded that peaceful solutions were impossible thanks to politicians and the media. Disturbingly, when the major news networks discussed Breivik's attacks, they claimed that Breivik had been inspired by Western bloggers like Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller. Now, reporters for these networks had gone through Breivik's manifesto, so they knew why he gave up on any sort of peaceful solution to the problem. They knew that politicians and the media had convinced him to turn to violence. And they knew that Breivik began planning his attacks in 1999 and 2000, long before any of us had heard of Robert Spencer or Pamela Geller. And yet, the media lied to their viewers and readers by claiming that Breivik was inspired to kill by Spencer and Geller. Now, Spencer and Geller are peaceful critics of jihad and Sharia. They condemn terrorist attacks. Why would the media claim that Spencer and Geller are responsible for Breivik's actions? They blamed Spencer and Geller because they wanted to use the attacks to further silence critics of jihad and Sharia. Let's think about this. Breivik said that he decided to kill because politicians and the media were blocking open, honest discussion about Islam. And the only way he could think of to break through their barriers of bias and misrepresentation was to go on a killing spree. Politicians and the media then used Breivik's attacks to block open, honest discussion about Islam. They kept doing exactly what convinced Breivik to go on a killing spree in the first place. These are the same journalists who, after every terrorist attack that followed, assured us that Breivik is a Christian terrorist, even though Breivik said that his religion is Odinism and called Jesus pathetic. Why did they assure us that Breivik was a Christian? Because they needed a Christian terrorist to help them block criticism of Islam. Look, you don't blame Christianity for Breivik, do you? So why do you blame Islam for Osama bin Laden? Breivik, of course, has been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, so there is a mental health component to think about. But as far as his motivations are concerned, are these motivations that are shared by other people? Are there people who are concerned about Muslim immigration? Yes, lots of them. Are there people who are concerned about Islam? Yes, lots of them. Are there people who have abandoned all hope of finding a peaceful solution to the problem? Yes, but fortunately there aren't many. Most people who are concerned about Islam are still convinced that they can get along with their Muslim neighbors and deal with Islam as an ideology. In other words, they draw a distinction between an ideology and the adherents of the ideology. If you're convinced that communism is a threat to the world, that doesn't mean that you have to start killing communists. It means that you start warning people about communism and trying to convince communists that they're on the wrong path. Likewise, if you're concerned that Islam is a threat to the world, that doesn't mean that you have to start killing Muslims. Instead, you study Islam and try to show people why it's dangerous and false. Based on some of the comments I get, I know that some of you are thinking to yourselves, that's not enough, David. You can't deal with Islam that way. It's too late for a peaceful solution. And to that I respond, how do you know? We are the first generation of non-Muslims who have open access to Islam's most trusted sources. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim were only translated in the 1990s. The other major hadith collections were translated even later. Historically, people didn't have this material for refuting Islam. We're also the first generation of non-Muslims who have open access to Muslims around the world. For nearly 14 centuries, Muslim leaders have been able to keep Muslims in a state of ignorance, never hearing criticisms of Islam and never hearing a case for alternatives to Islam. We're the generation that can talk to Muslims in Mecca on Facebook using our smartphones. No generation has ever had the opportunities we have for confronting Islam as an ideology. So when you tell me that the time for talk is over and that we need to fight, what are you basing this on? I've seen tons of Muslims leave Islam, and I'm not even warmed up yet. We just started refuting Islam, and we've been doing it with politicians and reporters and educators and Muslim leaders constantly telling Muslims, don't listen to those guys, they're all liars. If a handful of people posting critiques on blogs and social media can convince so many Muslims to leave Islam, imagine what things would be like if millions of people learned how to refute Islam. Islam would crumble. Lots of Muslims would realize that their leaders have lied to them and they'd leave Islam. Those who decided to remain Muslim wouldn't have the numbers or the confidence to be plotting global domination. Problem solved. Peacefully. Now, just to be clear, when I say that the problem can be solved peacefully, I don't mean pacifistically. Obviously, governments still need to deal with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And just as obviously, police and intelligence organizations need to deal with terrorists. But as far as the average Muslim in the street, the average Muslim leaving a London mosque after Ramadan prayers, no one should be trying to kill these Muslims. If you disagree with their ideology, as I do, refute their ideology. Islam cannot stand up to criticism and can only maintain its claims in an atmosphere of ignorance or of violent oppression. That's why Muslim leaders have been killing critics of Islam since the beginning. But David, it's so much work going through the Muslim sources. The Quran is so boring. Wait, you'd rather have a global bloodbath than learn to refute a boring book? Seriously? Listen, the day that Western nations would rather slaughter people in the streets than use our freedom of speech to refute ideologies, that's the day the West dies. The nations might live on in some sense, but they wouldn't be the same. A Great Britain that kills because it's too stupid and too spineless to debate would no longer be Great Britain. It would be Zombie Britain. So that's my response to critics of Islam who are wondering if we can really refute Islam peacefully. I say we can. But what about the Islamophiles who defend Islam? As for those of you who are watching this and thinking to yourselves, what? Refute Islam? That would be evil and immoral. We need to shield Islam from criticism at all costs. You're the morons who value the ideology of Islam over the adherents of Islam. Islam has no feelings. It has no rights. It doesn't deserve our respect or our protection. It calls for our violent subjugation, and for that, as an ideology, I'd be quite happy consigning it to the trash can of religious history. And yet, you still want to protect it. Why? What's your game plan here? How are you going to avoid people killing each other in the streets when they get so fed up with their government's inability to protect them that they decide to take matters into their own hands? As far as I can tell, you guys only have two basic plays in your playbook. One, after every Islamic terrorist attack, you tell us that it had nothing to do with Islam. You've been running this play for years. How's that working out for you? After every attack, politicians, reporters, educators, and actors unite in a grand chorus of nothing to do with Islam. How many terrorist attacks have you stopped with that strategy? 0. So, we write the words epic fail over that play. You run your other play when people start to realize, even after you've run your first play thousands of times, that jihad does have something to do with Islam. And when they realize this, your only move is to call them racists and bigots and Islamophobes. How's that working out? Are people becoming less concerned about jihad because you keep calling them racists? No, they're becoming more concerned about jihad because jihadis are blowing up their children. So, you have as much influence as it's possible to have. You've got politicians across the board. You've got all of the major news networks. You've got Hollywood. You've got the entire education system. You've got it all. And yet, with all of that power, all of that influence, you have done less than nothing to solve this problem. You are completely helpless to stop terrorist attacks, and you are completely helpless to keep people from becoming justifiably concerned about Islam and jihad and Sharia. Let's do the math here. Islam is spreading rapidly, due primarily to high birth rates and immigration. As Islam spreads, are terrorist attacks going to increase or decrease? If you answered decrease, please make an appointment with your doctor and ask for an industrial strength laxative because you are full of it. Terrorist attacks are going to increase. And as they increase, are people going to become more concerned about Islam or less concerned about Islam? more concerned about Islam. Notice the temperature is rising on both sides. How does this end? It either ends in a global bloodbath, or we come up with a peaceful solution before the global bloodbath. I have put a perfectly peaceful solution to the problem on the table. Stop protecting Islam from criticism. Tell Muslims the truth. Their leaders have been lying to them all their lives. Have some basic respect for them as human beings. Sit down with them and tell them the truth. Show them that the Quran has not been perfectly preserved. Their leaders lied to them about that. Show them that the Quran contains no scientific miracles. Their leaders lied to them about that. Show them that Muhammad was not the greatest man who ever lived. Their leaders lied to them about that. Tell them the truth so that they can make an informed decision about whether to follow Islam. And once they have the opportunity to make an informed decision, so many of them will leave. And so many of them who remain will have a shaky faith that I doubt we'll be seeing many more terrorist attacks from either side. That's a peaceful solution. If you reject it and you have no plan B for dealing with terrorism, then all you can do is continue shouting, "Terrorism has nothing to do with Islam," and "anyone who quotes the Quran is a racist." And we already know where that's gotten us. So if you Islamophiles continue with your ridiculous strategy, which we know only leads to more violence, and you avoid a straightforward, peaceful solution, then let me be the first to tell you, you're the ones who are killing Muslims. Politicians are killing Muslims. Reporters are killing Muslims. Teachers are killing Muslims. Actors are killing Muslims. You're killing Muslims by silencing critics of Islam and convincing them that there is no peaceful way of dealing with Islam. Some of these disheartened, desperate, frustrated, hopeless people will eventually choose the path of violence because you blocked all other paths. So do us all a favor and either help us refute a dangerous ideology for the good of both Muslims and non-Muslims, or sit down, shut up, and stay out of the way. Because some of us are trying to save lives, not feelings.